King Charles did not soften his words. He did not ask the family to prepare, and he did not leave room for negotiation. In one sudden royal announcement, the monarch declared that he would abdicate while still alive. The crown would pass directly to William, and Camilla would retain no royal title under the new order. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then Charles placed the signed paper down, and the monarchy entered its most dangerous hour. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Charles entered the gathering carrying a sealed folder, and William knew his father had not called them for an ordinary family discussion. Camilla understood it too. The crown meant the authority of the reigning monarch, while abdication meant a sovereign choosing to surrender the throne while still alive. Charles was not discussing a distant possibility. He was ending his own reign and placing William before a responsibility neither could treat lightly. Camilla did not move. She gripped the arms of her chair and stared at the king as the meaning settled over her. A royal title was more than a form of address. It carried an official place, duties, and identity. She had expected change when William became king, but she had never expected Charles himself to order her title removed. The Queen Consort whispered his name, but he did not look away. William felt no triumph. The prince leaned forward and asked whether the decision was final. Charles answered with one word, yes. The future king remained silent. An early succession meant taking responsibility for the monarchy, his family, and the next generation before expected. Yet his father's expression made one fact clear: the king had already decided. Charles opened the folder and admitted the announcement had not been written that morning. For weeks, he had privately prepared an abdication framework, the formal plan explaining how royal power and responsibilities would transfer. He had done it away from Camilla. Her shock hardened into hurt. She asked why her title had been singled out and why he had carried it out alone. The monarch closed the folder and told her there was one matter they would discuss privately. William watched his father's hand remain on the cover and suddenly understood that surrendering the throne was only half the crisis. Charles had made a separate decision about his wife, and the reason behind it threatened to cut deeper than succession itself. Before the crown could pass to William, Charles would have to explain why the woman beside him had suddenly been written out of its future. To the outside world, this was a constitutional earthquake. Inside the family, it was something far more painful. Charles was the husband preparing to strip his wife of her royal identity. William was a son being pushed toward the throne before he had expected it. And Camilla was facing the brutal possibility that the man she had stood beside had planned her removal in silence. The crown was changing hands, but 3 lives were breaking in 3 very different ways. Charles remained with William after the others had left, and the silence between father and son carried more weight than the announcement itself. Succession meant the formal passing of the throne from one monarch to the next, and for the king, it was no distant theory anymore. He admitted that William needed to inherit while his father was still alive to guide him. That mattered because the prince would not only take the crown, but he would also inherit a divided household, a nervous institution, and expectations that could crush an unprepared family. William listened without interrupting. Catherine, George, Charlotte, and Louis immediately filled his thoughts. The future king understood that accession would change every part of their lives because becoming sovereign meant placing public duty above private routine. Charles looked at his son and admitted that giving up the throne felt like surrendering the final duty he had waited a lifetime to perform. He paused once, then again. The king finally finished the sentence, but William could hear the grief behind every word. Camilla had already withdrawn alone. She removed a royal insignia from her jacket and placed it on the table with a sharp movement. The Queen Consort stared at it and asked herself whether Charles had already begun treating her as someone outside the monarchy. Her anger came from more than losing status. She had stood beside him through years of pressure, and now the man she trusted had prepared her removal without warning. William returned to the sealed plan and noticed something disturbing. Charles had separated the abdication decision from Camilla's future status. Her loss of title was not automatic. The king had deliberately written it into the framework, a transition plan explaining how power and royal roles would change. That detail changed everything. Charles saw his son's expression and spoke carefully. He said love and monarchy could no longer be allowed to answer the same question. William felt a cold unease. The prince did not ask what his father meant. Instead, he began tracing the previous weeks in his mind. Then one memory returned, a private royal ceremony, a tense exchange, and Charles leaving before anyone expected. Because the real beginning of Charles's decision was not the announcement itself, but a single night when Camilla crossed a line the king could no longer ignore. Every royal crisis has a moment that only looks important after everything collapses. For Charles, that moment came during a private succession ceremony at Windsor 3 weeks before his announcement. It was supposed to be controlled, symbolic, and brief. Instead, Camilla made one request in front of the king that changed his expression instantly. William noticed it, Charles never forgot it, and by midnight, a conversation behind a closed door had pushed the monarch toward the most drastic decision of his reign. Charles remembered the Windsor succession review with painful clarity. The review was a private ceremony where transition protocols, the rules explaining how duties would pass into the next reign, were examined before change became public. William sat beside his father and Camilla listened carefully. Nothing seemed dangerous until the Queen Consort asked that her future royal style and ceremonial position be protected, and after abdication, Camilla spoke with force. She argued that years of service should not disappear when Charles surrendered the throne. The king turned toward his wife and asked whether she understood that the meeting concerned William's reign. She answered that her future could not become an administrative footnote. The words landed hard. William felt the tension sharpen because the prince knew this was no longer about ceremony. It was about who would still matter when power changed hands. William tried to calm them. He reminded both that no final decision had been made, but Charles closed the protocol book himself. The monarch told his son to leave them alone. The future king hesitated, then obeyed. When the door shut, Camilla faced her husband without aides or advisors between them. Charles confronted her directly. He said her request sounded like an attempt to secure influence beyond his reign. Camilla recoiled and insisted she wanted dignity, not power. The Queen Consort reminded him what she had endured beside him while he accused her of discussing a protected place in William's monarchy before William had inherited. The argument instantly became painfully personal. Charles left that exchange carrying a decision he had not possessed earlier. According to the documented private account later included in his transition file, the king summoned a trusted constitutional advisor before midnight. He gave one stark instruction: prepare an abdication framework in which the next monarch inherited freely with no permanent royal position reserved for Camilla. The advisor asked whether Charles wanted time to reconsider. The monarch said no. Camilla would eventually discover that Windsor had triggered everything. And when she did, silence would no longer satisfy her. 3 weeks after Windsor, husband and wife finally stood alone again, and Camilla was ready to force Charles to say the one truth he had avoided. Camilla did not enter the room as a queen defending ceremony. She entered as a wife demanding an answer. No advisors, no secretaries, no William standing between them. Charles remained beside the table as she closed the door and asked him to look directly at her. Then came the question that shattered every layer of royal restraint. Why had he chosen abdication, William's immediate succession, and her complete loss of title in the same announcement? Charles's answer was devastating. Charles left the signed abdication folder between them. Abdication meant a reigning monarch voluntarily giving up the throne, and the folder carried the written plan for transferring royal authority. The king knew why this mattered. His decision would not only end his reign, it would also separate Camilla from the official identity she had built beside him, and she understood that separation had been deliberate. Camilla pushed a chair aside instead of sitting. The Queen Consort told him she was not challenging William's right to inherit. She was furious because Charles had tied his own departure to an order stripping away her royal status. "Look at me and tell me why," she said. The king finally raised his eyes. Duty had protected him from emotions until that moment. Now his wife was forcing him to face the wound behind the decision. Charles spoke about Windsor, the Monarch admitted the succession review had frightened him because he heard Camilla defending a future position in William's monarchy before the prince had even become king. She called that interpretation cruel. The Queen Consort insisted she had asked for dignity after years of service, not control over another reign. He answered that the difference had become impossible for him to ignore. Camilla demanded the full truth. Charles gave it through their private, recorded conversation, later preserved in the transition account. After Windsor, the king reviewed every proposed future role connected to his household. He personally ordered her title protections removed from the abdication framework, the formal plan controlling how duties and royal positions would change. The monarch had not delegated it, he had chosen it. Camilla stared at him and asked the question she feared most. Had William demanded this? Charles answered instantly, no. The prince had known nothing. The future king had neither requested her removal nor designed the order. Charles accepted the blame completely. That truth left Camilla more shaken because there was no hidden rival to confront, only her husband. Then the king delivered the final blow. His authority could begin the change, but William's reign would define what followed. Once the prince accepted the crown, the new royal order would belong to him. Camilla had confronted her husband, but the more frightening reality was waiting elsewhere because the final shape of her future would soon rest with William. Charles could announce his departure, he could state his wishes, but the monarchy that followed would belong to another man. William understood that distinction. The moment he was handed the transition file, he did not celebrate. He did not call Catherine immediately. Instead, the prince remained seated, reading the same paragraph twice. His father's abdication would make him king, yet hidden inside the machinery of succession was an even harder responsibility, deciding whether Charles's final demand concerning Camilla would survive. William opened the file again. The transition framework was the written plan explaining how duties, royal authority, homes and official roles would move into a new reign. Charles had begun the process, but the future king would still have to shape his own household after accepting the crown. That mattered because one decision could define William before his reign had truly started. Compassion might look like weakness. Firmness might look like revenge. Catherine found him still reading. William closed the file and admitted that he refused to begin his reign by punishing Camilla for years of complicated family pain. The princess understood the fear behind his words. She reminded him that rejecting revenge did not mean rejecting Charles's judgment. Her husband looked away. He could protect the monarchy or appear to settle an old family wound. The future king feared the country would never separate the two. William returned to the page concerning Camilla and noticed a signed declaration attached behind it. Charles had written that the no title instruction belonged to him alone. The king accepted full responsibility and stated in the documented transition record that his son had neither requested nor designed the decision. The wording was deliberate. The monarch was protecting William from any claim that he had engineered Camilla's fall before taking the throne. That protection disturbed the prince even more. William requested a private meeting with Charles. The king listened as his son asked whether he expected the instruction to be reversed after accession, the formal moment when an heir becomes monarch. Charles did not pressure him. He simply said, "I expect you to understand why I made it." The future king studied his father and realised there would be no easier answer. Catherine later watched William reopen the file. She saw him pause over Camilla's name, then place his hand on the page without turning it. The prince still had not decided, but the palace had already begun moving. A single call reached Camilla's household. One meeting was reassigned. One familiar duty disappeared from her schedule. And suddenly, Charles's announcement was no longer just words. The words on Charles's paper had sounded historic, but Camilla would only understand their true force when the palace began acting on them. The first consequence was not a crown being removed or a title disappearing from a proclamation. It was a telephone call, brief, polite and unforgiving. Camilla's private secretary listened, thanked the caller and slowly lowered the receiver. A scheduled royal planning meeting had been reassigned to William's transition team. Camilla would no longer attend. When she was told the Queen Consort remained perfectly still, then she asked one question: has Charles approved this? The answer broke something inside her. Camilla waited for the reply. Her private secretary explained that the transition plan had already entered its first practical stage, meaning future reign duties were now being separated from Charles's remaining responsibilities. William's team would handle preparations connected to the next monarchy. The change mattered because the cancelled meeting was not ceremonial. It concerned household planning, staff structure and duties Camilla had expected to influence for years. The secretary spoke carefully. Charles had approved the framework that allowed the reassignment. The king had not personally cancelled that one meeting, but his signed plan had made the decision possible. Camilla heard the difference and hated it. She dismissed the secretary, opened her folder and pulled out a handwritten schedule filled with future duties. The Queen Consort read each line slowly. Several now belonged to someone else. Camilla sat alone with the pages in her hands. Her anger faded into something colder. This was no longer a threat, hidden inside an announcement. Her place was shrinking in real time. The woman who had spent years beside Charles now faced a future where every familiar responsibility could be removed without another argument. She folded the schedule and asked for arrangements to leave the main royal residence earlier than planned. William faced pressure of his own. Nervous courtiers urged the prince to defend Camilla publicly before silence hardened into accusation. The future king refused. He told his transition team that he would not contradict Charles before speaking to his father one final time. A courtier's documented account later recorded his exact concern. Any rushed statement could make compassion look like rebellion against the king. Charles received Camilla's message soon after. The monarch read that she intended to leave early, removed his glasses and set them down. He understood what her departure meant. His wife was no longer waiting for another explanation, yet the king did not order anyone to stop her. That silence reached William. The prince closed his transition file and stood. No advisors, no courtiers, no formal meeting. He went directly to his father. With Camilla withdrawing and the palace dividing around them, William finally closed the door on protocol and asked his father what he truly wanted from his son. There was no crown in the room, no advisors, no documents being passed from hand to hand, and no Camilla waiting outside. Only a father and a son, confronting the moment both had spent their lives moving toward. William asked Charles one simple question. Was he abdicating because he had lost the strength to reign, or because he believed the monarchy needed to escape the conflicts of his household? The king remained silent for a long time. Then he gave William the truth. Charles looked at his son and finally spoke without the language of duty protecting him. Succession was the formal transfer of the throne from one monarch to the next. But this conversation had moved beyond procedure. William made it clear that he would accept the crown if his father was certain. The prince would not, however, inherit through an unresolved private war between Charles and Camilla. That mattered because any hidden bitterness could follow him into his own reign and divide the family before it began. Charles admitted that he still loved his wife. The king said the Windsor confrontation had forced him to see something painful. His marriage and the future monarchy had become dangerously tangled inside his own decisions. Camilla's request had frightened him, not because she wanted dignity, but because he could no longer trust himself to separate her needs from the crown's future. The monarch's private recorded account later preserved the confession exactly as he gave it to William. William softened. The future king told his father that abdication would not erase the hurt between Charles and Camilla. It would not make Windsor disappear. The prince warned him that surrendering power could simply leave the same pain behind. Charles listened, then answered that remaining king only to postpone pain would be the greater betrayal of duty. The silence changed. Charles then gave William the deeper reason. The monarch wanted to surrender the crown while he was alive so his son could begin a reign with a father still present. He did not want to become a shadow, influencing every decision through old expectations. The king wanted William to ask for advice freely, not obey him out of fear. William finally understood. The prince said he would respect Charles's no-title settlement for Camilla, but he would not permit public humiliation. The Queen Consort would be treated privately with dignity, even as her royal status ended. Charles nodded. Father and son had reached a decision neither considered a victory. Yet millions knew nothing of this confession. By morning, one newspaper image would turn private pain into national judgment. Charles had given William the truth in private. At dawn, Britain would decide what it believed the abdication meant. By sunrise, the private agony of one royal family belonged to the entire country. The announcement dominated broadcasts, phones, breakfast tables, and every conversation surrounding the monarchy. But one front page captured the shock more powerfully than any speech. Beneath a stark photograph of Charles walking alone, 3 enormous words appeared: "The crown passes." At Buckingham Palace, a crowd began gathering before morning had fully broken. Some cheered William, others stood silently. Everyone understood that history had accelerated overnight. William watched the coverage beside Catherine, and the noise of public reaction unsettled him more than he expected. Broadcasters described the announcement as a rupture unlike anything in the modern royal story, a living monarch preparing to surrender the throne to his son while removing his wife from her royal title. Abdication meant a reigning sovereign choosing to give up the throne. And the new settlement was the formal arrangement defining roles after that change. This mattered because Charles was not only ending a reign, he was redrawing the family around William. Catherine heard one commentator call the prince victorious. William immediately looked away. The future king told her nobody in the family had won. Charles was surrendering the role he had waited decades to hold. Camilla was losing the royal identity she had carried beside him, and he was inheriting a crown wrapped in private pain. Catherine stayed close as her husband admitted that triumph was the last thing he felt. Camilla faced the headlines alone. The Queen Consort unfolded the newspaper, saw her photograph beside the words "no royal title," and folded the front page once. She pushed it away. Her silence carried anger, but also humiliation. The palace communication had confirmed the decision without softening it. Charles would abdicate, William would inherit, and she would hold no royal title under the new arrangement. Outside Buckingham Palace, one moment captured the national mood. An elderly woman stepped towards the gates, placed flowers down, and left a handwritten card thanking Charles while wishing William strength. Broadcasters repeated the image throughout the morning. The crowd did not speak with one voice, yet that small gesture revealed the strange balance of grief and expectation now surrounding the monarchy. Charles heard demands to alter the wording concerning Camilla that morning. The king refused. A documented palace briefing recorded his answer. Changing it now would turn a painful decision into royal panic. The monarch would not retreat. One final meeting remained. Charles still had to face William and Camilla together. The public had chosen its headlines, but the true verdict would be delivered behind palace doors when Charles faced the 2 people most changed by his final act as king. In the end, there was no shouting, no desperate reversal, no last-minute rescue of the old arrangement. Charles stood before William and Camilla knowing that one decision had changed all 3 of their lives. His son would become king while his father still lived. His wife would leave her royal title behind, and he, the man who had waited longer than almost anyone for the crown, would surrender it by choice. The shock was over. What remained was the painful dignity of accepting what could no longer be undone. Charles brought them together for one final private conversation. The public announcement had already become national reality. An abdication, the formal act of a monarch giving up the throne, was no longer a threat or a possibility. The king told William and Camilla there would be no reversal. He would surrender the crown, his son would inherit, and his wife would hold no royal title under the new settlement. That clarity mattered because uncertainty had already wounded all 3 of them. Now only truth remained. Camilla looked directly at her husband. The Queen Consort told him losing the title hurt less than discovering how long he had carried the decision alone. Charles apologised for the secrecy. The monarch admitted he should have spoken sooner, but he refused to apologise for protecting the transition, the planned movement of royal power into William's reign. She listened quietly. For the first time, anger gave way to acceptance. William then turned to Camilla. The prince told her his reign would honour Charles's settlement without treating her as an enemy. He would not restore the title, but neither would he permit humiliation. The future king spoke carefully because his first choice would define the tone of his monarchy. Camilla studied him, then quietly accepted that the royal life she had known was ending. Charles opened the folder. The king removed the abdication paper and signed the final declaration in their presence. A final declaration was the written statement confirming his decision and allowing the transfer to move forward. He set the pen down and told William, "Now it is yours to carry." William did not reach for the document. The prince stepped toward his father and embraced him. Charles held his son, and in that moment, the transfer of power stopped feeling like victory. It became a farewell between a monarch and his heir. Camilla left without a royal title, but not through public degradation. Charles left the throne having separated marriage from succession at enormous personal cost. William inherited with a clear boundary around his reign. The verdict was final. The king chose the monarchy's future over the comfort of preserving his household unchanged. Camilla's silence marked a painful ending. William's restraint signalled a different reign, and Charles gave up the crown before his family's fractures could define the son who followed him. With the pen resting on the table and William finally accepting the weight before him, Charles's reign ended not in defeat, but in the brutal, deliberate sacrifice of a king who chose what came after him.